Hey, 42 here. On the 28th of September, 1987, a woman marched into the Department of Health in the Brazilian city of Goiânia and dumped a dusty old sack down on the nearest desk. When the startled doctor sitting opposite asked what was going on, the woman's answer was simple. The contents of this bag are killing my family. At first, the doctor didn't believe her. After all, the not remotely ominous sack appeared to be full of random bits of scrap metal. But over the course of the following 24 hours, he was forced to dramatically reassess that hasty conclusion. Because, as it turns out, the contents of that old sack weren't just killing the woman's family, they were a very serious threat to the entire city. This is the story of the Goiânia accident, one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. In 1985, a private radiotherapy clinic in the Brazilian city of Goiânia moved across town into a newer, swankier building. The old premises were scheduled to be demolished, but due to a last-minute legal dispute, some of the clinic's erstwhile treatment rooms were left partially intact. As the months went by, the gutted shell of the building grew increasingly derelict, and rumours began to circulate that not all of the clinic's medical equipment had made the journey to the new premises. You don't need to be Dr. House's financial advisor to know that medical devices can be pretty pricey, and it wasn't long before a couple of scavenger hunters turned up looking to make a quick buck. Their names were Roberto Alves and Wagner Pereira. And on the 10th of September 1987, they spent several hours picking through the debris inside the old clinic before one of them hit the jackpot. This jackpot was clearly a medical device, though exactly what kind of medical device, they had no idea. Still, it was very large, extremely heavy, and most importantly of all, it looked bloody expensive. The machine was too bulky to take home in one piece, so Alves and Pereira removed the priciest looking part, a large, irregularly shaped chunk of stainless steel, and took it back to Alves's place in a wheelbarrow. The plan was to dismantle it and sell the parts for scrap. But before they could begin, both men started to feel unwell. Considering their symptoms, sickness and diarrhea, they naturally assumed it was something they'd eaten. But Pereira in particular continued to deteriorate. One of his hands swelled up and a strange rash appeared on the palm that almost looked like a burn. Understandably concerned, he took himself to the local doctor, but he was reassured that he'd had some kind of allergic reaction and prescribed a week's bed rest. Whilst Pereira put his feet up, Alves started trying to dismantle the device. It proved to be incredibly difficult. Whatever the thing was, it was built like a tank. But over the course of 3 days, he managed it. As he'd suspected, inside he found plenty of valuable scrap metal, including a surprisingly large amount of lead. But it was the curious aluminium cylinder hidden right at the very heart of the device that really caught his eye. Whatever the machine was, this aluminium cylinder, not much larger than an espresso cup, seemed to be the thing that made it work. The cylinder had a small glass window at one end. Alves smashed it with a screwdriver and had a poke around inside. To his disappointment, the cylinder was filled with what looked like grains of rice made of some kind of solid material that crumbled into powder at the slightest touch. He had no idea what this substance was, but so far as he could tell, it was worthless. The device was now completely disassembled, and Alves took it to a local scrapyard, where he sold it as a job lot to the owner, a man called Ferreira. After concluding the sale, Ferreira dumped the haul in his garage for processing and forgot all about it. But that very night, whilst doing his rounds of the scrapyard, he noticed something very strange. The pile of scrap he'd bought that morning was glowing. On closer inspection, Ferreira tracked the source of this strange blue light down to the chalky substance inside the aluminium cylinder. As the owner of a scrapyard, he was an expert on a wide variety of different materials, but Ferreira had never seen anything like this strange glowing powder. His best guess was that it was some kind of crushed up gemstone, or, failing that, something supernatural. Whatever it was eerily fascinating. And over the following 3 days, he invited friends, family, and neighbours to come and admire the mysterious substance for themselves. He was even generous enough to allow several of them to take a small amount of the stuff home with them. One such lucky recipient was his brother, Ivo. He took a few grains of the glowing substance home to show his daughter, Leda. As Ivo had hoped, Leda was captivated by the mysterious substance, especially when she realised she could paint it all over her skin so that she glowed like a fairy in a storybook. But her joy wouldn't last long. Within minutes, she was vomiting violently. Not far away, in the Ferreira household, Devar's wife, Maria, was feeling equally poorly. Like many people she knew, she was suffering with a sickness bug of some kind, and her symptoms eventually became so severe that she visited the local hospital. As had been the case with Wagner Pereira 6 days earlier, she was told she'd had some kind of allergic reaction and sent home to rest. Imagine walking into a massive library full of really interesting books, but there's a weird, mysterious guy following you around, and every time you open a book to read it, he peers over your shoulder. Unsettling, right? Well, that's basically what's happening when you browse the internet without a VPN, especially in a public location. That's why I use ExpressVPN. It enables users worldwide to protect their privacy and security online with just a few clicks. ExpressVPN makes you much more anonymous online by encrypting your data and routing it through a secure server, so your internet service provider can't see your activity. It's incredibly easy to use, just fire up the app and tap one button. And it works on all your devices, phone, laptop, even routers, so everyone who shares your Wi-Fi can be protected too. Plus, you can easily change your online location so you can watch content from other countries on streaming services, such as Netflix. I've often used ExpressVPN to watch Netflix content from America that's just not available in the UK. And it works perfectly every time. For instance, I just used it to unlock this fascinating documentary, Squaring the Circle, the story of hypnosis, on US Netflix. Find out how you can get 3 months free by scanning the QR code on screen, clicking the link in the description box below, or simply going to expressvpn.com/42. That's expressvpn.com/42 to get 3 months free. Don't miss out, and a big thank you to ExpressVPN for sponsoring this video. Back at the scrapyard, her husband, Devar, who was also feeling ill, had tasked 2 of his employees with further breaking down the scrap metal he'd bought from Roberto Alves. When they were done, Devar sold most of what was left to another scrapyard. By this point, remnants of the strange glowing powder and the machine it had once been a part of were spread all across the city of Goiânia, and in some cases, far beyond. But it would almost certainly have spread much further were it not for the quick thinking of Maria Ferreira. Like everybody else, she had no idea what the strange glowing material was. But, unlike everyone else, she'd made a vital connection. Everyone that touched it had gotten sick. Knowing where all of this is going might not seem like much of an impressive mental leap, but the protagonists of this story almost all came from poor backgrounds and had very limited education. Many were illiterate and likely didn't even know what radiation was, let alone what the symptoms of radiation poisoning looked like. Maria had been told by a medical professional that she'd had a simple allergic reaction. It must have taken a lot of courage to challenge that diagnosis, especially when the alternative was so outlandish. But Maria Ferreira was convinced. And so, along with an employee from her husband's scrapyard, called Geraldo da Silva, she collected what remained of the glowing powder and everything else she could find that had come into contact with it. Then she and Geraldo hopped onto a crowded local bus, I know, yikes, and headed for the offices of the Goiânia Department of Health. And this is where we circle back to the scene at the start of this video. Maria dumped the sack of scrap metal on the nearest desk and explained that its contents were killing her family. After what I can only assume was a very awkward silence, the doctor asked Maria a few questions. How many people were ill? What was wrong with them? Where the random crap on his desk came into it? You know, that sort of thing. Based on her answers, he concluded that the mysterious sickness was likely nothing more than a nasty case of food poisoning, or perhaps some kind of tropical disease. And so he sent Maria and Geraldo to the nearest hospital for tropical diseases and got back to work. But it seemed that something in Maria's story continued to nag at him, because later that afternoon, he removed a sack of scrap metal from his office and put it on a chair outside in the courtyard. He was pretty sure it was harmless, but it's better to be safe than sorry. And with that in mind, once back at his desk, he picked up the phone and placed a call. Maria and Geraldo arrived at the hospital for tropical diseases not long afterwards, and it quickly became clear that Maria and her family weren't the only ones experiencing these unpleasant symptoms. In fact, it seemed that a kind of mini epidemic had broken out in Guyana. Maria even saw at least one familiar face. Wagner Pereira had been admitted to the same clinic several days earlier when his own symptoms had continued to worsen. As yet, the cause of this strange illness was unknown, but one young doctor was starting to develop a theory. There was nothing remotely unusual about sickness and diarrhea, common symptoms of literally hundreds of ailments, but many of the patients had accompanying skin complaints, burn-like lesions, unusual swellings, and skin discoloration. The doctor had a feeling he knew what was causing them, but his theory was so utterly insane, he was too embarrassed to share it with his colleagues. Instead, he picked up the nearest phone and placed a call. Dr. Alonso Monteiro was a medical physicist, specializing in both tropical diseases and toxicology. And during the afternoon on the 28th of September 1987, he received two very unusual phone calls. The first was from a doctor at the Guyana Department of Health, who claimed to have been given a mysterious sack of junk that was making people ill. The second was from another doctor who suspected that the patients swamping his clinic were suffering from radiation poisoning. Had Dr. Monteiro received just one of these phone calls, he might have dismissed it as nonsense. But to receive them both on the same day, just hours apart, well, it was probably worth investigating. And so, he made a phone call of his own, this one to the Guyana State Environment Department, where he requested that a scientist be sent to test a sack of scrap metal for radioactivity. At first, the Environment Department had a bit of trouble finding a suitable person for the job. But, as luck would have it, medical physicist Walter Ferreira happens to be on holiday nearby at the time. He didn't have any of the necessary equipment with him to test the sack, obviously, but he had a few contacts at a local government agency involved in uranium prospecting, and they agreed to lend him some gear. He picked up a kind of radiation monitor called a scintillometer from their offices in Guyana the following morning, then hopped in a cab to go and test a sack of scrap metal. Whilst en route, he decided to familiarise himself with the borrowed device, but as soon as he switched it on, it went haywire, reading off the scale for harmful ionising radiation in all directions. Assuming it was broken, he asked the taxi driver to turn around and went back to get a new one. This time, he switched a replacement device on as soon as he stepped out of the building, and exactly the same thing happened again. It could only mean one thing. The devices weren't defective. Somewhere nearby was a massive source of ionising radiation. Showing admirable bravery, Walter Ferreira didn't hesitate. He headed straight for the Guyana Department of Health to investigate the mysterious sack for himself. He knew he wouldn't actually be able to determine how radioactive it was, with the scintillometer reading off the scale. No matter where he pointed it, it was essentially useless. But Walter knew that this was already an incredibly dangerous situation, and the only way to contain it was to understand exactly what was going on. When he arrived at the Department of Health, he found several fire engines waiting outside. It turned out that the doctor who'd spoken to Maria Ferreira the day before had grown so nervous about the sack, he'd called the emergency services and asked them to dispose of it. Luckily, Walter arrived before they got the chance, because the Guyana Fire Department had been planning to dispose of the highly radioactive sack of scrap metal by dumping it into the nearby Meyer Ponte River. Had that actually happened, it would have caused an environmental catastrophe. Walter called the fire brigade off and ordered the immediate evacuation of the entire hospital. He then set about trying to figure out exactly what he was dealing with, and more importantly, where the hell it had come from. Walter managed to trace the sack back to De Vere Ferreira's scrapyard, and from there back to the old abandoned radiotherapy clinic in the north of the city. A few phone calls later, he was able to confirm that somehow a radiotherapy machine had been left behind in the building when the clinic relocated 2 years earlier. Inside that machine, there had been a single aluminium cylinder containing 93 grams of highly radioactive cesium chloride, a cesium salt made with a radioisotope called cesium-137. That was incredibly bad news. These days, cesium chloride is very rarely used in radiotherapy because it's so dangerous. If the source is compromised, cesium chloride salts are highly soluble in water and easily dispersed in the air in powder form. In other words, cesium-137 is a nuclear disaster just waiting to happen. Walter reported the findings and they were soon escalated to the very highest levels of Brazilian government. Within a matter of hours, the situation in Goiânia had been labelled a full-blown nuclear emergency. Priority number 1 was to deal with the highly radioactive remains of the dismantled radiotherapy device. It was far too dangerous to move it in its current state, so instead a crane was brought in to lower a large section of sewer pipe over the offending sack, where it sat on a chair in the courtyard of the Department of Health. That pipe was then filled with concrete. The wider response to the incident was huge, with hundreds of specialists flown in from all over Brazil. Teams of Geiger counter-wielding scientists assessed the known contamination sites. Specially fitted cars cruised the streets seeking other sources of contamination, and the helicopter was brought in to comb the entire city from the sky. Neighbourhoods where significant levels of radiation were detected were evacuated immediately, and the nearby Olympic Stadium was transformed into a giant testing centre for those suspected of having come into contact with radioactive materials. A lab was set up to test for contamination of the city's soil, groundwater, air, food produce, and river water, and the movements of everyone known to have been contaminated were traced backwards in time, uncovering several more contamination sites across the city, and in some cases, far beyond. Once the team had determined how far the contamination had spread, it was time to begin the cleanup job. 14 different areas of the city were found to have heightened levels of radioactivity, as well as 85 separate residences. Where levels of radiation were relatively low, pressure washers and specially designed vacuum cleaners were used, but in many cases, that wasn't enough. Some buildings had to be demolished entirely, and many of the families affected were forced to give up all of their possessions because they simply weren't safe to handle. In total, 3,500 cubic meters of cesium-contaminated nuclear waste was removed from the city, enough to fill 275 lorries. It was taken to a remote location 15 miles outside of the city and buried. Over the course of the following few weeks, over 100,000 people were tested at the Olympic Stadium. More than 1,000 of them were found to have been contaminated. Of those, 249 had significant levels of radioactive material, either on or, in some cases, in their bodies. And a further 20 people were so radioactive that their urine and feces had to be disposed of as nuclear waste. Thankfully, the vast majority of those affected survived with little to no long-term effects. But not everyone was so lucky. Of the scavengers who originally uncovered the radiotherapy device, Wagner Pereira lost a finger on one hand, and several others were badly disfigured, whilst Roberto Alves lost his entire right forearm. Geraldo da Silva, the scrapyard employee who took the radioactive materials to the Department of Health with Maria Ferreira, developed a huge radiation burn on his back where he'd carried the sack. This kind of skin damage was common amongst those who directly handled the cesium salts, and many people needed skin grafts. At the very heart of this story are the 4 people who tragically lost their lives due to acute radiation poisoning. Leda Ferreira, daughter of Ivo Ferreira, died on the 23rd of October 1987. 4 weeks after daubing the highly radioactive cesium-137 all over her body. She also ingested a significant quantity of the powder along with a sandwich she ate whilst playing with it. She was just 6 years old when she died, and the final weeks of her life were unspeakably terrible. Maria Ferreira, Leda's aunt and the woman who first made the connection between the glowing powder and the widespread sickness, died on the same day as her niece. In the final weeks of her life, she suffered hair loss, internal bleeding, and mental confusion. The other 2 victims, Admilson de Souza and Israel dos Santos, were employees at the Via Ferreira scrapyard, aged 18 and 22, respectively. Both had spent significant time working with the radioactive scrap metal. They died a day apart at the end of October 1987 after a great deal of suffering. The human cost of the Gaonia incident was incredibly high, but the impact of what is now considered one of the worst nuclear disasters in history went much deeper than that. The incident was front-page news in Brazil. That was to be expected, but what nobody anticipated was the reaction of the general public. It's worth remembering that all of this happened just a year after the Chernobyl disaster, so fear surrounding nuclear incidents was at an all-time high. Residents of the city of Gaonia suffered widespread prejudice and discrimination from people who feared that even going near them might be dangerous. Pilots refused to fly them, bus drivers wouldn't pick them up, and they were denied housing in other towns and cities. Businesses refused to buy goods made in Gaonia, and dozens of companies, large and small, went bankrupt as sales plummeted. The government began issuing certificates to people who were confirmed to be free of contamination, but if anything, that only made it worse. A prime example of how bad things got came at Leda Ferreira's funeral. She was laid to rest in a public cemetery, but her remains were so radioactive that she was buried in a specially built fiberglass coffin lined with lead. Despite these measures, the funeral attracted over 2,000 protesters who attempted to physically prevent the burial from taking place because they were afraid Leda's body would contaminate the surrounding land. The Gaonia incident remains one of the worst nuclear disasters in history, and the sad truth is that it could so easily have been prevented. You see, it turns out that the owners of the abandoned radiotherapy clinic in Gaonia hadn't forgotten about their old machine after all. Just 4 months before Alves and Pereira discovered it, one of the owners of the clinic went to try and remove the device. Due to the ongoing legal dispute between his company and the owners of the old site, he was prevented from recovering the machine. When he tried to insist, someone called the police, and he was forcibly removed from the site. Ultimately, the story of the Gaonia incident is one of tragedy and loss. It's also an eye-opening reminder of just how much chaos and devastation can be wrought by a few handfuls of innocuous-looking white powder. Thanks for watching. Just a quick word to say that I couldn't make these videos without the support of my Patreon members. Consider joining the exclusive 42 Discord community by supporting me on Patreon. It's a great place to discuss my videos with like-minded individuals and myself. The link's in the description, but if you don't want to, or you can't join my Patreon, then please don't worry. A simple like or comment to say thanks would also put a huge smile on my face. Thank you.